Chapter 4, we are going to be talking about the ecology of communities. And there's a lot of ways that communities can be altered or changed. One example that is given is that Asian carp have infested. This is obviously not something native. It's even has the name Asian carp, but it's not native to the United States, and it has been spreading all the way through like some of our southern states, including the Mississippi River Valley. And this uh, particular fish eats a bunch of other fish, eats their babies, and will also jump up different rivers and streams, like you can see here, to kind of spread through the whole place. So, scientists have done, and like different research teams and environmental groups have done things to create barriers to try to stop these guys from moving further north, even creating barricades, electric gates, things like that, that will block them from getting into Lake Michigan. We introduce non native species to different places in lots of ways. A lot of times, humans will carry them to other places. It can be even carried in the boat, water, like in what's called the ballast, which is like you can actually kind of purposefully flood the back of your boat in order to make it do this really cool, like, motion and make a nice wake if you like wakeboarding and things like that. And if that gets put in one lake one week and gets a bunch of water and eggs and plankton in it, and then that moves to the next lake another weekend, then a bunch of those things have been moved. Because of that, it's caused millions of dollars of damage when people move species, and that is highlighted throughout your book. So you can have several different interactions with species. In general, sometimes it's taught incorrectly, but when there is a relationship between two species, that is called symbiosis. Now, you can have multiple types of symbiosis. Sometimes symbiosis is incorrectly taught as both are benefiting. No, that's called mutualism. And mutualism is a type of symbiosis, it's a type of relationship, where one organism benefits and the other organism benefits. So they both like being around each other. Then you can have relationships like commensalism, where one organism benefits, but the other is neither helped nor harmed. It doesn't really care. And then the last type would be parasitism. Parasitism is when one organism is taking full advantage of the other one, and the other organism actually is partially harmed or killed in the relationship. So between species, you can have different competition. Sometimes you have intra-specific, where the same members of the same species are fighting and over the same resources, like all lions are fighting for the other lions for the same resources. Or you can have two totally different species competing for the same resource. In general, most populations have developed something called a resource partitioning, where the organisms that are there might have a little bit of infighting, but generally they've worked out where they're all hunting different things or different ways, but in the same area. And you can see how all these birds in these pictures are all using either the tree or the beach sand in a different way to harvest different organisms, but in the same place. So while they're all birds and eating in the same place, they eat different things and from different spaces. So that's called resource partitioning, when they are not all after the same thing. So um, a lot of times you can have things like parasitism or predation here, or you can even have some organisms that mimic other organisms and look scarier than they actually are. Predation, you generally know. Some of these are camouflage. You can see that sometimes animals have warning coloration to let them know of the risks. And there are certain, even kind of caterpillars like swallowtails, that grow butterflies, where they're babies in my yard. They eat the lime trees. They actually look like tiny little snakes. Okay. So This is an example of human parasitism. The guinea worm is actually a worm that will get into someone's skin by laying like an egg and drilling into their skin. It will develop into a full, huge worm. When it is ready to have babies and come out, it will release an acid on the person's skin to burn a hole through it. The person generally seeks water where the worm crawls out and lays a bunch of eggs to start its life cycle over again. Um, Thanks to people like Jimmy Carter and the Jimmy Carter Foundation, they have like nearly eradicated this parasite in people. After he left his presidency, he worked on this worldwide. In 1986, there were 3.5 million people worldwide that had this, and in 2022, they were down to just 2 people that had the guinea worm parasite. So generally, parasites and their hosts that they are living in will usually like co-evolve different mechanisms to stay away from each other. There are some organisms that only eat plants and they are called herbivores, but even that, plants maybe want to be slightly harvested and eaten for their own benefit. However, in many ways, they don't want to be over harvested. So many of them have evolved things like toxic chemicals, thorns, spines, or irritating hairs to get you to stay away from them. So I am going to move past some of these slides that have other details on them. But a community is a group of populations of different organisms. So these are not of the same species, but they do live in the same area and at the same time. So here is an example of several different species there, and these species interactions become very important. The producers are those that produce energy using sunlight, and they are the large majority of organisms. Things that eat producers are called primary consumers. Okay, like the grasshoppers are in the ocean, like the zooplankton will eat the phyto, which means plant plankton. Um, and then further up, the secondary consumers, they're like the bigger ones that will go and eat the tinier things. And the tertiary consumers will be the ones that pretty much hardly anything ever eats them. They're kind of the top level of the food chain. When we're talking about the energy in an ecosystem, this is actually really important. It's called the trophic level or energy pyramid, is what you'll hear it called. But basically, each level, as we go up from the producers to the consumers to the secondary consumers to the tertiary consumers, the amount of energy at that level will reduce by removing a whole zero. So, in this simplified form, if you have 1,000 units of energy on this level, you're going to cut off a zero for the next level, and you'll only have 100 units of level of energy available on the primary consumer level. Then, if you move up to the secondary consumer level, you're going to chop another zero, and we only have 10 units of energy. So, in other words, the largest category is going to be the plants, and the tiniest category is going to be the tertiary consumers. In other words, in the area that we live, there's like 1,000 times larger mass of plants than there are like owls or rattlesnakes and things like that. And that makes sense to a lot of people, but I just wanted to point that out. Okay, so another way of looking at how energy moves is by looking at food webs. So food webs take in all the complexities of things that, most things eat multiple different types of things, and most things have multiple predators that can eat them. So a food web draws lots of arrows to show those complexities. Within an ecosystem, there are certain species, and I'm going to highlight this elephant here, that end up being what's called a keystone species. And specifically, you could further call these elephants an ecosystem engineer. And a keystone species is one that without them, the entire ecosystem can actually collapse. And elephants take it a step further, and they are actually something called ecosystem engineers. Where Africa, if you look at Africa and where it is on the earth, it is on the same like equatorial plain area as a lot of places in South America that have a lot of rainforests. But Africa is not thought to have a lot of rainforest. Now, it does have some rainforest, but a lot of times people think of Africa being like a savanna. Well, part of that is because elephants actually have this behavior where they will go and knock down trees, and they basically do it for fun, and it's okay because they're very playful. And they will actually pull out trees and engineer the ecosystem to be a grass and savanna that is necessary for all the other species in Africa. So, the other species in Africa that exist, the lion, the cheetah, the wildebeest, the water buffalo, the rhino, they all need large grasslands to migrate and to hunt and to live and to eat. And if it was a rainforest, they would not get to live the same way. So, the elephants being an ecosystem engineer where they actually build the environment and maintain it the way it is for the other animals to exist, make the elephant the most important species there. So, in the ocean equivalent is actually a sea otter that does this in Southern California. They eat the urchins, and this video further explains that, and you can watch that if you have time. But essentially, the sea otters will go and eat the urchins without the sea otters eating the urchins, and they have a hard part on their chest, and they will actually crack these open and eat the meat with that hard padding on their chest. If they don't do that, then the urchins will eat the base of the kelp. It will kill the kelp to have the base eaten, and that nursery and that hiding place and that food place will be dead for all the other animals. In Southern California, this is a video showing the urchins eating seaweed, but in Southern California, we used to have sea otters and we don't anymore, and it has altered our ecosystem. So, a disturbance like that is when there's a rapid or drastic effect, like we've hunted all the sea otters and now the urchins have taken off in Southern California and they've killed the kelp. That is called a disturbance. Now, there's some ecosystems that are very resistant to a disturbance where they don't get highly bothered by a disturbance, and there's some that are actually pretty resilient where they will come back. However, there's some ecosystems that don't come back very easily. But when they do come back, the first species that comes back is called the pioneer species. And over time, and you can almost think of this as like the first weeds or something that comes back. Like if somebody plowed over a whole parking lot or plowed over a whole like wild space with a plow, to go over it for some reason, and then they decided to walk away and just see what regrew. The first species would come in and probably just be like weeds or tumbleweeds, things like that, and those would be pioneer species. After that, bigger and larger species will come in back into that space until it has its climax community, like hardwood trees or things like that have come back. Okay, so there's two different types of succession. One of them is called primary succession. Primary succession is when you have completely bare rock, brand new land, like a volcano or something like that has happened and made all new land. In that case, the primary succession takes a very long time to get started because you don't even have dirt there. You have solid rock. So you have to have like hundreds, if not thousands of years of lichens and other small things, animals like birds coming and pooping in the area and leaving slight amounts of soil for a little bit of soil to get there and grow. And after that, it will take off. Secondary succession is like the person that has now plowed over a field. there was at least dirt there and probably some seed matter, and so its regrowth happens faster. Here, I actually have a cool time lapse that you can watch if you have time about Mount St. Helens, and it would be a place where it had a primary succession, a large disturbance, which was the volcano, and then you can see over time how the trees regrew if you would like to watch that. It's kind of cool. Um, the next thing is when a community has been disturbed, it can sometimes have a regime shift, meaning the whole community basically was disturbed by this process, and now new plants are going to come in. So it's a regime shift. Like maybe there were oaks there before, and now it's going to be aspens, and so it really is not the native species that came back. And novel communities are those that occur in one place in the world and nowhere else in the world. Introduced species and non native species are a big problem. All of these are nasty Southern California non-native species that other people either dropped snails in all of our yards because they spread snails throughout the United States because they thought everyone would like having free escargot, and I don't appreciate it now at all. Or these or tumbleweeds that got stuck and brought over here from, I believe, the Siberia area of the world. So all of these are things that do not belong here, and then they actually hurt our native species pretty badly. So you can actually watch the video that I have here on swamp rats. I will show you that in a minute and you can watch that. But it actually causes a huge disturbance to our ecosystems because usually nothing can eat it, and usually it can eat everything else because it doesn't have any predators that are hurting it. So it's actually a pretty bad thing to introduce species. So this is a video on the swamp rats. It's a problem that they're
We're in
having
a wetland
um,
in
in in California, and they are talking about how they have on camera traps seen the swamp rats and how they're messing up the whole ecosystem. They remind me of a movie where they talk about rodents of unusual size. That is the swamp rat problem to me. So going through and getting rid of the swamp rats is called ecological restoration. I actually got to work um, in Australia um, with the Mangala Aboriginal people. They actually decided to restore a wetland, and you can see the saltwater crocodiles that are there. They actually decided to buy part of Australia back from ancient like sugarcane fields that were purchased, I believe, by the French in the 1800s, and they bought the fields back to restore this wetland. So every year they allow different volunteers to come out here and replant the native species and trees. And now this whole wetland has been restored, and you can watch this video and see how gorgeous this wetland restoration is. The importance of this is the wetland does actually clean out more pollutants than any other ecosystem in the world. And so by having clean out space before this water reaches the Great Barrier Reef is very important for keeping the Great Barrier Reef clean. So I put a link here so you can see what they are doing there at Mongala. So I do believe highly that not just wetlands, but everywhere can be restored to its natural condition. It just takes effort on our part. So here's a picture of a former canal where they had diverted the natural water, and here is how they, shut the canals and let the river go back to normal. So the last things is here's a picture of the Earth's biomes. You can see that we live in this tiny little red area called a chaparral, which is not highly represented on the world map. Um, and so some of the only places here are like in Australia or Southern Africa, down South America, and in the Middle East, some of it. Interestingly, I got to live in the Middle East. And I took some different pictures here that I thought you might be interested in because these look almost exactly like our hills in Southern California. And that is because we have the same chaparral that they have in the Middle East. So, but these were all pictures from the Middle East. Okay. So generally, climate determines the biomes of different places. So there's and basically you will places that have more water are generally going to have more plants. That is not a surprise to many of you. Um, and so I'm going to move past some of these because you can go through and read about the different types of biomes like the temperate rainforest, the tropical rainforest, the tropical dry forests, savannas. I'll point out these types of graphs and show you how to read it. The red line is the average temperature through the year, and the blue is how the rain comes in. So you can see, like in a savanna, they have like a rainy season, but then it has like lots of dry season. Or like back here at a tropical rainforest, their temperature is pretty steady and their rain is pretty high and steady. When we go back or down to like deserts, and we're pretty close to a desert, you can see that the temperature stays pretty high with a peak in the summer, but the rain stays low throughout the rest of the year. And you can see that reflected in the lack of plant life out there in the desert. Interesting, the tundras, people don't think of it this way, but tundras are actually very dry. And you would say, well, I disagree with that. Look at this river in the background and like all the plant life. Well, tundras actually don't have very much evaporation because it is so cold that it stays frozen under the soil just a few feet down, and that's why it's called permafrost. It's permanently frozen underneath the soil. So this water actually can't percolate down into the ground because it's completely icy down there. So even though they get very little rain, they actually stay pretty wet. You can check out boreal forests and chaparral. This is like ours, although I think I would argue that we get even less water than that. And then this is a very powerful video here that I recommend that you watch. It shows different places on the earth and the how different areas are being forested. So it's got about a 40-year spread, I believe, through most of the pictures where they have aerial pictures from, I believe, about the 80s to current day, and you can see how things have changed. So this first one is in Bolivia in 1984, and here's the deforestation seen from space to 2020. So 1984 to 2020. Surprisingly, in this video, some of the places that get shown are actually in the United States. So we tend to think we're not doing that in the United States, but we are. And frankly, in a big way, when we're buying products from foreign countries, we are contributing to them deforesting. So it's something to think about. Like in this image, they are showing in this video in Oregon. So there's 1984 in Oregon, and there's 2020. Not as devastating. We didn't take advantage as much, but you can see that there's a change. So that wraps up everything for our Chapter 4 slideshow about the ecology of communities.